Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air. Our program is presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. It's the 39th week of 2014. Aware was established 13 years ago after the 9/11 attacks by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East. Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and control of them gives the U.S. an advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. The U.S. invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were as much about imperial control as Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. Last night, in direct continuation of that murderous policy, which he said he would end, President Obama attacked yet another country. He's attacked the opponents of the Assyrian regime he said he needed to attack a year ago. But then he was prevented from bombing Syria by public opinion and Russian diplomacy. Now, President Obama's decision to bomb Syria stands in stark violation of international law, the UN Charter, and the requirements of the U.S. Constitution. Even if he could get a craven and unrepresentative Congress, now in recess, to agree, as they agreed to support Israel's massacre this summer, his actions are still criminal under the UN Charter, which forbids the threat or use of force in international affairs when not approved by the UN Security Council. Hypocritically enough, Obama went to the Security Council today, but for PR, not to request the legal authority that he knows he doesn't have and can't get. If the UN were an effective organization, he would be arrested and tried like President Milosevic of Serbia was. The U.S. has begun bombing Islamic militants in Syria using a mix of fighter, bomber, and Tomahawk land attack missiles, the Pentagon announced on Monday night. The Pentagon spokesman said in a statement that the U.S. and partner nation forces, the partners are Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Bahrain, and Qatar, were undertaking military action against members of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or ISIS. The U.S. military plans to strike up to 20 targets with what they call manned and unmanned air assets, this is Pentagon speak, including F-22s, B-1 bombers, F-16s, F-15s, and FA-18s. Your tax money at work. The aircraft carrier USS George H.W. Bush, appropriately enough, is at the ready in the Persian Gulf, and the USS Arleigh Burke, a guided missile destroyer that fires Tomahawk land attack missiles, is in the Red Sea, and those land attack missiles apparently have been used against Syrian cities already. The White House's stated goal is to destroy the headquarters of the violent and extremist ISIS militia. But you can't bomb extremism out of existence. The U.S. bombs do not fall on extremism. They're falling on Raqqa, a 2,000-year-old Syrian city with a population of more than 250,000 people. Men, women, and children who had no say in the takeover of their city by ISIS. The Pentagon is bombing targets like the post office and the governor's compound, and the likelihood of large number of civilian casualties, as well as devastation of the ancient city, is almost certain. Bombing Syria without congressional authorization, without United Nations approval, in direct opposition to the stated position of Syria's government, will only make that crisis worse. It will give ISIS and its allies a new basis for recruitment. It will strengthen the repressive Syrian government. It will undermine Syria's struggling nonviolent opposition movement insofar as it exists. And it will further tighten the links between ISIS supporters in Syria and in Iraq. The president also announced he's attacking Iraq, where the U.S. has killed hundreds of thousands of people in this decade. The president who promised hope and change has become the fourth president in a row to bomb Iraq. Like the others, he says he's doing it to fight terrorism, in this case the ISIS group, which was originally funded and supported by principal U.S. allies in the region, from Saudi Arabia to Turkey. Obama says he's killing more people in the Mideast because ISIS threatens Americans and what he called American interests. That's partly true because the principal American interest is the control of Mideast energy resources. But that's in the interest of only 1% of Americans, the rich who profit from U.S. control of the world economy. Obama's new killing is called fighting terrorism because terrorism is the name the U.S. gives to the armed resistance, which of course can be vicious and brutal, to the generations-long U.S. invasion of the region. Even the greatest example of terrorism, the crimes of 9/11-2001, were counterattacks. Al-Qaeda said they were launched for 3 reasons. 1, Israel's oppression of the Palestinians. 2, the Clinton administration's sanctions on Iraq, which killed 500,000 children, and Clinton's Secretary of State said was worth it. And 3, Saudi Arabia's allowing U.S. troops into the Muslim Holy Land. The Obama administration is now trying to rally the Sunni alliance, principally Saudi Arabia and Israel, against ISIS, hoping to continue to use it against the Shia alliance, Iran and Syria, with Russia and China in the background. But the U.S. has no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And those interests are the interests of the U.S. 1% in controlling the Eurasian economy by means of controlling Mideast energy resources, the world's greatest material prize, as the State Department put it in 1945. Shortly after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Zbigniew Brzezinski, an advisor to Democratic presidents from Carter to Obama, pointed out that America's control over the Middle East gives it indirect but politically critical leverage on the European and Asian economies that are also dependent on energy exports from the region. If the United States can maintain its control over Iraq, with the world's second largest known oil reserves and right at the heart of the world's major energy supplies, that will enhance significantly its strategic power and influence over its major rivals in the tripolar world that has been taking shape for the last 30 years, one pole being the U.S. itself, the second being Europe, and the third being Northeast Asia, that is China and Japan, linked as they are to the South and Southeast Asian economies. It is a rational calculation on the assumption that human survival is not particularly significant in comparison with short-term power and wealth, and that's the view of the American 1%, and that is nothing new. These themes resonate through history. The difference today, in this age of nuclear weapons, is only that the stakes are enormously higher. If the U.S. were not controlled by the 1% wedded to the military-industrial establishment, and if common sense were the operative principle, it would make sense to refrain from any military action, leaving it to the Iraqi and Syrian people to deal with these new oppressors, perhaps with local power support. The record shows that the U.S. military actions in the Middle East produce no good for the people of the region, but rather lots of harm. It's not in the interest of the vast majority of Americans to kill people around the world for the profits of the 1%. But that's what the American government has done, up to and including President Obama's administration. In 1967, the civil rights leader Martin Luther King admitted with dismay that, quote, "the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government," close quote. Tragically, nothing has changed in the intervening years. American presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years, mostly civilians. Not to spread peace and democracy as they claimed, but to ensure U.S. economic control, as the rest of the world recognizes. They have made the U.S. government the most feared and hated in the world. One of the first and most read books about the 9/11 attacks pointed out accurately, quote, "Everybody's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, there's a really easy way. Stop participating in it. In much of the world, the U.S. is regarded as a leading terrorist state, and with good reason. The U.S. has 1,000 military bases outside its borders. Russia and China have none. The U.S. Special Operations Command, a 63,000-member private army that reports to the U.S. President's National Security Council and not to Congress, is active by its own admission in 124 countries around the world. Its activities include rendition, that's kidnapping, enhanced interrogation, that's torture, and disposition, That's murder. Read about the CIA's disposition matrix. Last year, President Obama told White House aides, "Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." In his Terror Tuesday sessions, as the administration explained to the New York Times, Obama has selected, from baseball cards presented to him by CIA Director John Brennan, thousands of people to be killed. Obama's drone strikes alone have resulted in 5,000 deaths, including 200 child corpses. The unavoidable conclusion is that the Obama administration wants war in the Mideast, not just for the profits of the arms makers, although that is an important consideration for the U.S. government, but because otherwise there's no propaganda justification for U.S. military control of the region. If peace breaks out, there's no reason for the U.S. military to be there. And in the last 24 hours, Obama has widened the killing, joined in this action, as he said, by our friends and partners, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Bahrain, and Qatar. They, in alliance with Israel, are Obama's dog's bodies in the present round of murder in the Middle East. You're watching Aware on the Air. Aware wants to stop the child killers in the White House and the Congress in their efforts around the world on behalf of the American 1%. We try to do that by exposing the real story of what's going on, over against the false account that the U.S. media, a creation of big business, want you to believe. We'll challenge that false account tonight with commentaries by Szoke and Karen Aram, and we'll begin with Szoke on promises.
I'll extend a little bit some of Carl's remarks about what's happening in Syria. This is from New York Times breaking news piece. U.S. and allies hit ISIS targets in Syria. Much of this will be just a repetition. The United States and its allies launched airstrikes against Sunni militants in Syria early Tuesday, unleashing a torrent of cruise missiles and precision-guided bombs from air and sea on the militants' de facto capital of Raqqa, Syria, and along the porous Iraq border. Notice the phrase precision-guided bombs. That always turns out to be a hoax again and again. Invariably, it seems. It will turn out weeks or months later that there was very little precision in the bombing, and there were a lot of deaths from what is called collateral damage. American fighter jets and armed Predator and Reaper drones flying alongside warplanes from several Arab allies struck a broad array of targets in territory controlled by the militants known as the Islamic State. American military officials said the targets included weapons supplies, depots, barracks, and buildings the militants used for command and control. Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired from United States Navy ships in the region. They are everywhere, of course. The strikes represent a major turning point in President Obama's war against the Islamic State and open up a risky new stage of the American military campaign. Until now, the administration has bombed Islamic State targets only in Iraq and has suggested it would be weeks, if not months, before the start of a bombing campaign against the Islamic State targets in Syria. So, again, what we thought was a commitment to restraining all of this firepower in the Middle East turns out to be inoperative, as we've learned to say. Meanwhile, an editorial yesterday or today in the New York Times, which is a little surprising because they can, the New York Times editorial board can be relied upon generally to not contradict anything that they view as a national security matter or something concerning Israel. But anyway, backsliding on nuclear promises. For much of the last 6 years, President Obama has talked about working toward a world without nuclear weapons. Yet his administration is now investing tens of billions of dollars in modernizing and rebuilding America's nuclear arsenal and facilities. As the Times reported in detail on Monday, and after good progress in making nuclear bomb material more secure around the world, Mr. Obama has reduced his budget request for that priority. This is a short-sighted and disappointing turn. When he first came into office, Mr. Obama was clear-sighted about nuclear dangers and ambitions and his disarmament goals. His major arms control achievement was the New START Treaty with Moscow, aimed at reducing deployed strategic weapons from, to 1,550 on each side, down from the 2,200 previously, by February 2018. But to win Republican support for the treaty in 2010, Mr. Obama made a Faustian bargain, promising to spend $84 billion to upgrade aging nuclear weapons over the next decade, a $14 billion increase over the regular $70 billion modernization budget. But the Congressional Budget Office now estimates Mr. Obama's plans will cost $355 billion over the next decade. Other studies put the price at $1 trillion over 3 decades. The wish list includes 12 new missile submarines, up to 100 new bombers, 400 land-based missiles, plus upgrades to other major nuclear facilities and so on. Notice that I keep saying nuclear because it's easier to say than saying it correctly, nuclear. So backsliding on nuclear promises. Earlier piece in the New York Times, paths to war then and now haunt Obama. We are given to understand that this additional nuclear armament and spending is due to the national security concerns of the USA, and we're threatened by these developments in Iraq and Syria. So this has been disappointing to a lot of people. Mr. Obama, I don't get any particular joy out of denouncing him or praising him or either one. I think too much is said in both directions. But anyway, he has made something of a career of backing down and caving in on what we took to be promises earlier in his political career. So he seems to have an extremely naive view, shall we say, of many of these matters. He's naive about bipartisanship and compromise and so on. It does raise the question in my mind about why this keeps happening to everyone in that office. The pressures of that office, that institutional position, are enormously in one direction. And Mr. Obama seems to have been clear, at least at one point, what the pressures would be and what he would need to do to resist them. But in the end, apparently, they've become overwhelming. And why does this keep happening to everyone in that position? So, Carl and others, if you can suggest someone who you think could possibly have become president of the United States and would stand up to such pressures from the Pentagon and the State Department and so on, please name that person. That would be very interesting.
Ralph Nader.
Well, could he have conceivably become president?
Maybe
I don't know.
today.
Thank you, Ron.
Yeah.
Maybe today.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We're going to go around and we'll have a chance for some comments on the things that have been said already and the things that are about to be said by Karen Aram.
Okay, well, the last 3 times I've been on this program, I have quoted from the Worldwide Socialist website. So when I saw an article, I think it was Saturday or Sunday, that they had related to Obama's modernization of the Kansas nuclear facility, I declined to prepare to speak on that. Needless to say, I, like Ron, I was quite surprised when I saw it in the New York Times yesterday. They, of course, New York Times eliminates some of the rhetoric, but at the same time, it closely followed what the Socialist website, which has been very prescient regarding just about everything that's been happening today. So I'm pleased that Ron did cover that. As to Obama, who I try to be civil. I try. I'm not always. I am not above using profanity. But I'm not going to refer to the President of the United States as a terrorist or a baby killer, even though I think the title is quite apt.
Simple fact.
It's just not my. It's just not my choice of language. I prefer to use administration.
What, you want a job at the University of Illinois or something?
You'd think so. No. But I do have to disagree that he's in any way naive. I think he's a very intelligent, cool-headed man who knew exactly what he was getting into when he was elected. And I gave him time, okay, when he was first elected, thinking, well, he's doing the best he can, blah, blah, blah. But at this point, I think that, no, I'm sorry, he hasn't, and it's not because he's weak. He is not weak. He is not, the things that he is doing, but I prefer to think of it as the administration. And I do agree with Carl. I think that Ralph Nader would have stood up to them. I think the women, whose name I cannot even remember now, that ran for the Green Party the last time, female doctor, and I'm sorry I can't remember her name, I think that some of the U.S. Green Party, even though I know they've capitulated in Germany and other nations, I think that they would have. But of course, could they get elected? Probably not.
Jill Stein, right?
Jill Stein, thank you very much, yes. I'm wondering if somebody like Ralph Nader couldn't get elected at this point in time, given what is happening, given that so many people now see what our government represents, given the numbers, the thousands that were in New York over this weekend and Monday. The coverage on the corporate-owned media was very limited. Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! Covered it very well, and UPTV, our station here, presents Democracy Now! Central Time, 7 o'clock in the morning, again 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and then again sometimes at 11 o'clock in the evening. So only those who are watching that or going online really know what is happening. And as Medea Benjamin said this morning, it's, you know, here we are when we've had the largest turnout for climate change ever in the world. And then at the same time, we're announcing that we're striking targets in Syria. It's, yeah, I'm not going to go on any further on any of this, but that's it.
Thank you, Karen. Do you want to talk about the pivot to Asia today? Have you got
Not
some
really,
Asian material?
not really. I do have some things, but it's rather trivial at this point in time. I'll save it for another time. Right now, I think we're dealing with two of the most serious situations. One is the war in the Middle East, and one is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Those are the two most serious issues that mankind. Oh, excuse me, and I left out climate change.
Yeah, that's right.
The three, yeah. So
three of our weapons.
Yes, yes. So I will leave it to the two of you to discuss all of these issues, which are far more important.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You're watching Aware on the Air. Ron, do you have some responses?
Well, yes. I think everyone, or almost everyone, is kind of naive about the pressures that come to bear when you're in an office like that. And I think he swallowed the civics textbook line that it was good and virtuous to have bipartisanship and to make compromises and so on. And my guess is he probably arrived in believing a lot of that, but that was extremely naive, I believe, still. And many people are not aware that it's difficult to turn slogans into policies when you have hundreds and thousands of people beating on you from both sides or all sides, trying to get you to do what they want you to do. And if you've never held a position of supposed leadership in an organization like that, you may be a little naive yourself in the effects of that. Social pressure can be enormous, as we've learned again and again from psychological research, and people wind up doing things that they never thought they would do. In fact, they would swear that they would never do such a thing. And it's, I think, a somewhat disappointing fact about human nature, that people can be pressured into doing all kinds of things, that if you had told them in advance they would wind up doing that, they would have claimed that they were grossly insulted.
Would you say the same was true of the major political leaders of the 20th century?
Yes.
Wilson, Stalin, Hitler, you know, they
Yes,
were just
yes,
pressured
yes,
into
yes.
These things?
Yeah, that's very generally true.
Good heavens.
I think you're much more. I'm sorry. I think that's very kind, Ron. I really do. I think that that's very kind of you. I have held positions of leadership, certainly not in the same as the President of the United States, but I have been in positions where I have had to go to my employer and suggest that I was being asked to do something that I did not feel was right, and knowing that I could end up not being able to feed my daughters and being on the streets of Bangkok. Okay, it was that bad. But in each case, I was fortunate that I had supervisors who were like, okay, that's fine, whatever. But so I'm just saying that I'm not saying that I would be any different than the president right now. But, you know, we were talking about Colin Powell not that long ago, how, oh, he had to go in front of the UN, he had to make the statements he did. Well, no, he didn't. There's such a thing as resignation.
Right.
Yeah.
You can resign, and Obama could resign. I mean, that would make enough of a statement in and of itself. And this is what I'm saying. I've been in that position where, yes, you jeopardize your life, but at the same time, you can resist. As long as a gun is not at your head, okay, obviously, and even then, look, we've had people who've been in those positions and refused to do. How can he live with himself, knowing that he's responsible for the deaths that are happening?
Yeah. Do we just
Over
assume
resignation.
then that these people are innately evil, or that they turn that way
No.
at some point in
No,
their lives, or what?
I'm not even saying that they're innately evil. I won't go that far. I'm saying that we have a system. Look at all the Americans around us who support what's happening right now, because they're blinded by the image that, well, gee, we have to have the oil, we have to have the resources. So I'm saying it's some kind of a psychological brainwashing that our society has placed us in, whereby we are superior, we are the anything we do is okay. And it's all about somehow going in with guns and killing people is somehow saving people. So I think that it is about education. I think it is about media, corporate media control. Now, the President of the United States, he has advisors. I mean, Brzezinski is one of Obama's major advisors. Good God, how does he, you know? So, no, I'm sorry. And Nixon had Kissinger. I mean, these people are, some of these people, I'm sorry, I do think are evil. But I won't go so far as to say Obama is. But I don't think he's naive. And he will have to answer at some point or another. And I go along with the whole idea that they should be brought, all of these leaders should be brought before the International Criminal Court, even if it's merely a, what is the word I want to use, just a facade where it doesn't have any teeth because we are not a member, but at least it would be a process, a legal process that I think would be a start. They need to be shamed, okay? They
Something
need to
like
be
the
shamed.
Russell tribunals, perhaps.
Yes, yes, yes. So, but I'm not going to excuse their actions.
No,
I'm
well.
not going to excuse their actions that they're naive or.
No, I
I mean, for
certainly
God's
don't.
sakes, he's a constitutional lawyer. I thought when he was elected that at least, oh, we have a constitutional lawyer. He will support the Constitution. Well, that's, sorry, that hasn't happened.
Well, again, I think you should recognize at some point that the institutional pressures are just enormous.
Of course, I do.
And momentum coming from the Pentagon and from the State Department, I think will overwhelm a lot of people who are naive, who think that they can exercise their conscience in some of these matters. But we have testimony to that again and again. And there's the interesting work of the Italian political sociologists who talk about what happens to people in organizations.
Well,
and
yes.
The way that can affect one's outlook and
Precisely.
values, and come to make you think that you should do things that earlier you would have sworn you absolutely never would do.
Ron, you just amaze me on this line. I mean, you're usually the one who suggests we should eschew psychological speculation on the motives and actions of political leaders and look simply at the objective results. What has happened? What have they decided? What have they done? And I suddenly find myself in agreement with you that we should look at that and that we should avoid this sort of psychological speculation. I don't believe for a moment that Obama is naive and or subjected to impossible pressures. The Chief Magistrate of the United States is a remarkably free chief executive. He doesn't have to be reelected. His personal fortune in the world is established. He has no external constraints on him whatsoever. He is free to act in a way that actually executives of other countries are not. There is the only legal constraint on a president of the United States is the threat of impeachment. And what we've done with that basically in the last generation or two, is remove it from the Constitution. Impeachment is a dead letter. It is now not being used except as another political manipulation. The extent to which the founders thought it could be used to stop criminality in high places, what they called high crimes and misdemeanors, doesn't work if it's always seen, as it apparently is now, as a partisan matter. Are you in favor of the president of your party or are you not? With the disappearance of that constraint, the president is relatively free. Now, a parallel thing happened in Britain, where, of course, we took our constitutional procedures from in the 18th century. Impeachment has dropped out of the British Constitution, but the reason it dropped out of the British Constitution was that the principle of majority government was established. That is, the government had to maintain a vote of confidence of a majority of the legislature, majority of parliament, in order to stay in office. And therefore, a president, a prime minister, could be removed by a majority of the parliament on a straight party line vote, basically whenever he lost his majority, whenever that majority in the parliament wanted to do so. We haven't got anything like that in this country. There is even less reason for an American president to be worried about pressures that can affect, that can respond to his actions, however criminal they might be.
What about Nixon?
There's a second issue there. Well, as I say, Nixon was driven from office, but under the threat of impeachment.
Right.
But that's exactly the threat that has been neutralized primarily by the Clinton impeachment. If Clinton had been impeached as he should have been, why, we would have perhaps had different politics in the following years. The main thing the Clinton impeachment did was to remove impeachment as a weapon in the political armory. There's another point here, though, the one that, as I say, I'm surprised to find you expatiating on. There has been a great move in American political science for more than a generation to concentrate on the notion of presidential character. A lot of it centered on the intellectual bodyguards of John Kennedy and the discussion of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the notion that fantasy that the world hung in the balance while the brave young president strode forth and prevented nuclear war. I mean, that is all fantasy. It's not what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis at all. But what it did do was send the political scientists, and remember, political science is to sciences military music is to music, it sent the political scientists off in the direction of considering presidential character. And we got a lot of arguments about that, which were extended in the Johnson and Nixon administrations after it. It means less than politics. It means less than the real political actions taken by the government as driven by its primary constituencies, most notably the American 1%. Someone like Barack Obama, who I think is not naive at all, but a man with an eye on the main chance all his life, and if you read his book about his father and his book about his audition piece for the presidency, the Mendacity of Hope, you find that here is a man who knew particularly well what he was doing. Indeed, if we want to get psychological about it, we could say he's someone who spent his life manipulating himself into higher positions, given that his background was so ambiguous. And he succeeded. He succeeded the same way he succeeded to become the first person of color to be editor of the Harvard Law Review. He had a talent for getting himself forward. But that seems to me not the issue. The issue is the one you brought up earlier, the politics. For example, his backsliding, his tergiversation on nuclear weapons. Here is the man who had said that he was going to work for, campaign for a nuclear-free world, and as you pointed out, he's busily now extending and renewing and expanding American nuclear weapon production. I thought that the most interesting line in the New York Times account of the administration's plans for nuclear weapons was the following. Quote, "The most fundamental game changer is Putin's invasion of Ukraine," said Gary Seymour, Mr. Obama's top nuclear advisor in his first term, and now a scholar at Harvard. Quote, "That has made any measure to reduce the stockpile unilaterally, politically impossible," close quote. Now, there we have a notion of the pressure, so to speak, offered by an Obama epigony, suggesting that the problem is that, well, of course, the aggressive imperialist action of the president of Russia has meant that Obama's promise to reduce nuclear weapons can't be carried out. Indeed, we have to go in the other direction. This is a flat-out lie. This is nonsense of such a transparent sort that it's hard to imagine unless we realize that the administration has been setting up this absolutely counterfactual account of what Russia is doing in Ukraine to cover over the fact that the administration produced an anti-democratic revolution in Ukraine and then backed the succeeding government in a war against the Russian-speaking region of Ukraine. To give that as the reason that Obama reverses his promise to reduce nuclear weapons is to pile, to put one enormity upon another. This is a lie about what the U.S. did in Ukraine, and we add to it a lie about why the U.S. is doing what it's doing about nuclear weapons. Now, this is understandable and has nothing to do with psychology. It has to do with an accurate account of the politics that are being pursued. It seemed to me an incredible admission and a hard-to-believe admission by the administration about how it intended to use this propaganda advance in regard to Ukraine, even in nuclear weapons. Well, it's all Putin's fault. This is such nonsense.
Okay.
Obvious nonsense.
Well, that disposes of me, but what about the issue?
Not much. Your psychology is still to be taken into account, Ron.
Do people's views evolve, or do we assume that Obama's views have been evil and vicious since birth, or what?
If I were as loaded as that question, Ron, I'd take a cab home. I really would. Look, what we're talking about here is the politics of the United States, what the U.S. government is doing. The U.S. government is busy, Barack Obama is busily killing people. He's killed a lot of people so far. He said he didn't know that was going to be his long suit, but he embraced it. He took it on perfectly reasonably, and anyone with a grain of sense, and he has more than a grain of sense, would realize that anyone who becomes president of the United States right now has got to decide whether he's going to kill people or not. Obama was elected because people thought he would bring hope and change, and that meant primarily the end of these wars that the U.S. was involved in. The voters of the U.S. have for almost a decade now voted against war. Obama certainly understood that, and in order to make himself president, pretended that he was against dumb wars, right? The minute he gets into office, he expands the war in Afghanistan and then turns to the most vicious members of the previous administration, notably the head of the John Brennan, who's now head of the CIA, to ramp up the wars beyond levels that the Bush administration ever imagined. The drone strikes were very few in the Bush administration. They've been Obama's preferred method of fighting the war because it doesn't involve American casualties. I mean, the politics are obvious.
I think that it's a mistake when we get into, well, what I dislike so much is this cult of personality, all right? I think Marx referred to it as that, ad hominem, whatever. I think that, Carl, you pointed out that it's too bad we actually vote for individuals. It would be much better if we voted for policies. And I think that that's one of the tragedies of our system today, is that an individual can come along and today we really delve into their character to try to smear their character as much as possible. I say we, meaning that the United States, as far as the electorate out there. We have a system whereby money talks. Money is what really creates the image of, or the personality of the individual. And I think that is really something that needs to be changed. Get the money out of politics, but also do something about, if there was anything I would change, it would be that we vote on the policies, not so much on the individual. I think that would give us more power. How to go about that, I don't know.
Yeah, well, there's a problem there, I think, due to a misunderstanding of democracy. Everything tends to devolve into a personality contest. Do you favor this person over that person?
Called a personality, and it trivializes everything. It really trivializes it down to the lowest denominator.
But it's not an accident. It's not something that just happens because, I mean, you know, there's a name for what we're talking about here. The name is demagoguery, where individuals, for their own advancement, try to use try to mislead, in fact, the public about what they will do in office. For example, if we look at the actual votes of Americans for the last decade, we see that Americans have voted against war. U.S. gave control of the Congress to the Democratic Party in 2006, and the Democratic leaders recognized very clearly at the time the reason they did so was that they wanted the wars to come to an end, that was an anti-war vote. Same way it had been in the 60s, for example, in similar circumstances. But the problem was that the Democrats in the Congress and the potential Democratic candidates for president in the middle 2000s and after the election of 2006 knew that their real masters, the American 1%, wanted the wars to continue. And therefore they had to, the short word is lie. They had to say that we're trying to reduce the wars, we're working towards a withdrawal, so forth and so on, when in fact they weren't. The Congress continued to support the wars, and the candidates, particularly those who said they were opposed to the war, got themselves elected. What the electorate has said is clear. The political system allows people to lie about what their policies are going to do, and then when get into office, do what they were going to do all along. This is not there's nothing sort of surprising about this. Remember that Richard Nixon was the anti-war candidate in 1968. That's true. John Kennedy was the anti-war candidate in 1960. When Kennedy and Nixon got into office, what they immediately did was expand the wars. It's not an unrecognizable characteristic. It is the way politics is done.
Another thing this leads to, what creates the appearance of centrism in the body politic, is that there are so many single-issue voters who are just concerned with one issue. And whether it's war or poverty or abortion or whatever it is, they want to vote for or against someone based on that issue alone. And then that makes, because there's so many different issues involved, the votes appear to pile up in the middle, and it gives the appearance of being a centrist vote. And I don't know what to do about that. Is it feasible to get people to vote for issues rather than persons? I'm not sure, but it deserves some discussion at least.
You don't have as much faith in democracy as Thomas Jefferson did, do you?
Well, again, I don't think a question of my flaws and faults, but there's a substantive issue here. And I'd like for us to be able to get at it rather than just pounding on me for my faults and flaws.
I'm more interested in what you think about democracy and that what the American public, how the American public actually acts.
It's a good idea. It deserves to be tried.
You just told me that the American public can't be trusted with democracy. At least
no,
I think
didn't
that's what you were
say anything
suggesting.
like that at all. That's false.
Okay. The Jefferson line that I had in mind was Jefferson saying that in every polity there was a dispute between the aristocrats and the populace. He didn't mean the aristocrats in the strict notion of the British aristocracy, but he did mean what we would call today an elite. He said, in contradistinction to the elite, in contrast to the elite, the people are the most safe, if not always the most wise, guarantors of democracy. His notion was that the popular will, as expressed by the population at large, would get to the truth faster than the elite because the elite was self-interested. He knew that pretty well, in part from his own background and being a member of that elite. Now, I think we have to recognize that any attempt at democracy is going to run up to Jefferson's notion that the populace may not be the most wise, it might not be the most wise repository of its the understanding of the purposes of the state. But it is the most safe, I think, and Jefferson thought so too. And it seems to me that when we begin to say, well, what we're dealing with here is the problems that the populace doesn't understand what it's interested in, we're going to make some errors. What we're going to do, as Jefferson suggested, is allow that elite to ride roughshod over the real interests of the people. And that certainly describes the present situation in America. You're watching Aware on the Air. The last few minutes. Oh, yes, go ahead, Karen.
Just one comment on behalf of Karen Levy, who isn't with us today, but she reposted on the Peace List something that Danielle Chenoweth posted, and that's regarding a meeting, planning meeting at the IMC at 6:30 Thursday, and this is in respect to the building of new jails here in Urbana and the weaponry, the militarization of our local police sheriff's department, whether it's the tanks or the drones. So I just thought I would put a plug there because this is something that is related to everything that we discuss regarding anti-war. It does begin on the local level, and here we are. We could end up with another Ferguson right here in Champaign. So.
Did you see the front page of the local paper on the 21st? Too many weapons. They obtained through a Freedom of Information Act a list of some of the Pentagon's heavy weapons that have been donated to local police departments. M16 rifles valued at $500 each, distributed to the Champaign County Sheriff, 25 of those, 24 to Champaign, 25 to Danville, 8 to Mattoon, and so on. MRAP, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, these armored trucks, they appear to be, valued at $733,000 each. The Champaign County Sheriff's got one of the 16 distributed around the state, and so on. It's amazing. Helicopters. The Winthrop Harbor Police Department got 10 of them. What are they going to do with 10 helicopters? Yeah. Including a Bell Huey helicopter and a medevac-style helicopter, and so on and on.
Well, that's in keeping with the need for a planning session.
They've been getting gas masks and bayonets, too, thousands of bayonets.
Yeah, who are they worried about, I wonder? Us?
It's an important point in that, you really do have to sit back and say, why has the federal government, and this administration, the last one, been so concerned about making military forces out of local police forces? Right. Fusion centers and other arrangements that have done that. And I think it's inescapable that there are people in the federal government establishment that really think public disorders in the future are a very real possibility in the United States in the event of a severe economic turndown or even epidemics, that they're worried about that at the Department of Homeland Security, which after all is a fairly recent construction of the American government, and they really are going as far as saying we've got to arm ourselves against the people, and that the way to do that is to make sure that we have police forces that won't put up with Occupy Wall Street sort of nonsense. Right. Even in the attempt to run a peaceable march in New York yesterday, there were a good number of arrests by police who are ready for anything. I think that's important. I just found the passage from Jefferson that I had in mind, and I was going to quote for you, Ron. This is Thomas Jefferson writing late in his life, long after he was out of the office as in the presidency. He says, people by their constitutions, he means they're in their psychological constitution, if you like, not the written kind. People by their constitutions are naturally divided into two parties. One, those who fear and distrust the people and wish to draw all powers from them into the hands of the higher classes. Two, those who identify themselves with the people, have confidence in them, cherish and consider them as the most honest and safe, though not the most wise, depository of the public interests. In every country, these two parties exist, and every one where they are free to think, speak, and write, they will declare themselves. Call them, therefore, liberals and serviles, Jacobins and ultras, Whigs and Tories, Republicans and Federalists, aristocrats and Democrats. These are pairings, 18th century pairings, of course, or by whatever name you please. They are the same party still and pursue the same object. The last one of aristocrats and Democrats is the true one, expressing the essence of all. Now, that was Jefferson writing in 1824. If we were to update that today, we would talk about the 1% and the 99%, perhaps. It's clear to us now, after 40 years of neoliberalism in this country, that the division is very much, as Jefferson realized, a class division, a division of groups who own the society and those who don't. The vast majority, of course, don't. And as Jefferson's friend, John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, put it, the people who own the country should govern it. Now there's a view of the founders over against the more extreme Democrats like Jefferson. Now, I don't think we've got too far away from that these days, and the question, and finally, is one of how the rule of the elite, the rule of the 1%, is to be masked from the 99% who have to be ruled. That's the job for people like Barack Obama.
Well, Jefferson lived before the age of mass media, and I think that requires some qualification of his views then. But anyway, that's all I have to say about it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the mass media are important, and the important part was that there was an extension, if you like, of the view Jefferson offered in the 19th century, in the American 20th century, when people realized that you couldn't use the club and the jail cell to control people's ideas well enough. You had to use propaganda. You had to use public relations. You had to find ways to do it that didn't leave marks, at least not physical marks. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 39th week of 2014. Our thanks, as usual, to Jason Liggett for direction and production. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see our Facebook page for Aware, where some notes and articles and observations on the things we discuss here are occasionally posted. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram and Ron Szoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, David Green, Yakov Ziso, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.